This is section 28 of Presidential Farewell and Last Addresses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. President Benjamin Harrison's last State of the Union Address, December 6, 1892, Part 1, read by John Greenman.
To the Senate and House of Representatives: In submitting my annual message to Congress, I have great satisfaction in being able to say that the general conditions affecting the commercial and industrial interests of the United States are in the highest degree favorable. A comparison of the existing conditions with those of the most favored period in the history of the country will, I believe, show that so high a degree of prosperity and so general a diffusion of the comforts of life were never before enjoyed by our people. The total wealth of the country in 1860 was $16,159,616,068. In 1890 it amounted to $62,610,000,000, an increase of 287%. The total mileage of railways in the United States in 1860 was 30,626. In 1890 it was 167,741, an increase of 448%. And it is estimated that there will be about 4,000 miles of track added by the close of the year 1892. The official returns of the 11th census and those of the 10th census for 75 leading cities furnish the basis for the following comparisons. In 1880, the capital invested in manufacturing was $1,232,839,670. In 1890, the capital invested in manufacturing was $2,900,735,884. In 1880, the number of employees was 1,301,388. In 1890, the number of employees was 2,251,134. In 1880, the wages earned were 501,965,778. In 1890, the wages earned were $1,221,170,454. In 1880, the value of the product was $2,711,579,899. In 1890, the value of the product was $4,860,286,837. I am informed by the superintendent of the census that the omission of certain industries in 1880 which were included in 1890 accounts, in part, for the remarkable increase thus shown, but after making full allowance for differences of method and deducting the returns for all industries not included in the census of 1880, there remain in the reports from these 75 cities an increase in the capital employed of $1,522,745,604, in the value of the product of $2,024,236,166, in wages earned of $677,943,929, and in the number of wage earners employed of 856,029. The wage earnings not only show an increased aggregate, but an increase in per capita from $386 in 1880 to $547 in 1890, or 41.71%. The new industrial plants established since October 6, 1890, and up to October 22, 1892, as partially reported in the American Economist, number 345, and the extension of existing plants 108, the new capital invested amounts to $40,449,050, and the number of additional employees to 37,285. The Textile World for July 1892 states that during the first 6 months of the present calendar year, 135 new factories were built, of which 40 are cotton mills, 48 knitting mills, 26 woolen mills, 15 silk mills, 4 plush mills, and 2 linen mills. Of the 40 cotton mills, 21 have been built in the Southern States. Mr. A. B. Shepperson of the New York Cotton Exchange estimates the number of working spindles in the United States on September 1, 1892, at 15,200,000, an increase of 660,000 over the year 1891. The consumption of cotton by American mills in 1891 was 2,396,000 bales, and in 1892, 2,584,000 bales, an increase of 188,000 bales. From the year 1869 to 1892 inclusive, there has been an increase in the consumption of cotton in Europe of 92%, while during the same period the increased consumption in the United States has been about 150%. The report of Ira Ayer, Special Agent of the Treasury Department, shows that at the date of September 30, 1892, there were 32 companies manufacturing tin and turnplate in the United States, and 14 companies building new works for such manufacture. The estimated investment in buildings and plants at the close of the fiscal year June 30, 1893, if existing conditions were to be continued, was $5 million, and the estimated rate of production 200 million pounds per annum. The actual production for the quarter ending September 30, 1892, was 10,952,725 pounds. The report of Labor Commissioner Peck of New York shows that during the year 1891, in about 6,000 manufacturing establishments in that state, embraced within the special inquiry made by him, and representing 67 different industries, there was a net increase over the year 1890 of $30,315,130.68 in the value of the product, and of $6,377,925.09 in the amount of wages paid. The report of the Commissioner of Labor for the state of Massachusetts shows that 3,745 industries in that state paid $129,416,248 in wages during the year 1891, against $126,030,303 in 1890, an increase of $3,335,945, and that there was an increase of $9,932,490 in the amount of capital, and of 7,346 in the number of persons employed in the same period. During the last 6 months of the year 1891 and the first 6 months of 1892, the total production of pig iron was 9,710,819 tons, as against 9,202,703 tons in the year 1890, which was the largest annual production ever attained. For the same 12 months of 1891-92, the production of Bessemer ingots was 3,878,581 tons, an increase of 189,710 gross tons over the previously unprecedented yearly production of 3,688,871 gross tons in 1890. The production of Bessemer steel rails for the first 6 months of 1892 was 772,436 gross tons, as against 702,080 gross tons during the last 6 months of the year 1891. The total value of our foreign trade, exports and imports of merchandise, during the last fiscal year was $1,857,680,610, an increase of $128,283,604 over the previous fiscal year. The average annual value of our imports and exports of merchandise for the 10 fiscal years prior to 1891 was $1,457,332,019. It will be observed that our foreign trade for 1892 exceeded this annual average value by $400,358,591, an increase of 27.47%. The significance and value of this increase are shown by the fact that the excess in the trade of 1892 over 1891 was wholly in the value of exports, for there was a decrease in the value of imports of $17,513,754. The value of our exports during the fiscal year 1892 reached the highest figure in the history of the government, amounting to $1,030,278,148, exceeding by $145,797,338 the exports of 1891, and exceeding the value of the imports by $202,875,686. A comparison of the value of our exports for 1892 with the annual average for the 10 years prior to 1891 shows an excess of $265,142,651, or of 34.65%. The value of our imports of merchandise for 1892, which was $829,402,462, also exceeded the annual average value of the 10 years prior to 1891 by $135,215,940. During the fiscal year 1892, the value of imports free of duty amounted to $457,999,658, the largest aggregate in the history of our commerce. The value of the imports of merchandise entered free of duty in 1892 was 55.35% of the total value of imports, as compared with 43.35% in 1891 and 33.66% in 1890. In our coastwise trade, a most encouraging development is in progress, there having been in the last 4 years an increase of 16%. In internal commerce, the statistics show that no such period of prosperity has ever before existed. The freight carried in the coastwise trade of the Great Lakes in 1890 aggregated 28,295,959 tons. On the Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio rivers and tributaries in the same year, the traffic aggregated 29,405,046 tons, and the total vessel tonnage passing through the Detroit River during that year was 21,684,000 tons. The vessel tonnage entered and cleared in the foreign trade of London during 1890 amounted to 13,480,767 tons, and of Liverpool 10,941,800 tons. A total for these two great shipping ports of 24,422,568 tons, only slightly in excess of the vessel tonnage passing through the Detroit River. And it should be said that the season for the Detroit River was but 228 days, while of course in London and Liverpool the season was for the entire year. The vessel tonnage passing through the St. Mary's Canal for the fiscal year 1892 amounted to 9,828,874 tons, and the freight tonnage of the Detroit River is estimated for that year at 25 million tons, against 23,209,619 tons in 1891. The aggregate traffic on our railroads for the year 1891 amounted to 704,398,609 tons of freight, compared with 691,344,437 tons in 1890, an increase of 13,054,172 tons. Another indication of the general prosperity of the country is found in the fact that the number of depositors in savings banks increased from 693,870 in 1860 to 4,258,893 in 1890, an increase of 513%, and the amount of deposits from $149,277,504 in 1860 to $1,524,844,506 in 1890, an increase of 921%. In 1891, the amount of deposits in savings banks was $1,623,079,749. It is estimated that 90% of these deposits represent the savings of wage earners. The bank clearances for 9 months ending September 30th, 1891, amounted to $41,049,390,808. For the same months in 1892, they amounted to $45,189,601,947, an excess for the 9 months of $4,140,211,139. There never has been a time in our history when work was so abundant or when wages were as high. Whether measured by the currency in which they are paid or by their power to supply the necessaries and comforts of life. It is true that the market prices of cotton and wheat have been low. It is one of the unfavorable incidents of agriculture that the farmer cannot produce upon orders. He must sow and reap in ignorance of the aggregate production of the year, and is peculiarly subject to the depreciation which follows overproduction. But while the fact I have stated is true as to the crops mentioned, the general average of prices has been such as to give to agriculture a fair participation in the general prosperity. The value of our total farm products has increased from $1,363,646,866 in 1860 to $4,500,000,000 in 1891. As estimated by statisticians, an increase of 230%. The number of hogs, January 1st, 1891, was 50,625,106, and their value, $210,193,925. On January 1st, 1892, the number was 52,392,019, and the value, $241,031,415. On January 1st, 1891, the number of cattle was 36,875,648, and the value, $544,127,908. On January 1st, 1892, the number was 37,651,239, and the value, $570,749,155. If any are discontented with their state here, if any believe that wages or prices, the returns for honest toil, are inadequate, they should not fail to remember that there is no other country in the world where the conditions that seem to them hard would not be accepted as highly prosperous. The English agriculturist would be glad to exchange the returns of his labor for those of the American farmer, and the Manchester workmen their wages for those of their fellows at Fall River. I believe that the protective system, which has now for something more than 30 years continuously prevailed in our legislation, has been a mighty instrument for the development of our national wealth, and a most powerful agency in protecting the homes of our workingmen from the invasion of want. I have felt a most solicitous interest to preserve to our working people rates of wages that would not only give daily bread, but supply a comfortable margin for those home attractions and family comforts and enjoyments without which life is neither hopeful nor sweet. They are American citizens, a part of the great people for whom our Constitution and government were framed and instituted, and it can not be a perversion of that Constitution to so legislate as to preserve in their homes the comfort, independence, loyalty, and sense of interest in the government which are essential to good citizenship in peace, and which will bring this stalwart throng, as in 1861, to the defense of the flag when it is assailed. It is not my purpose to renew here the argument in favor of the protective tariff. The result of the recent election must be accepted as having introduced a new policy. We must assume that the present tariff, constructed upon the lines of protection, is to be repealed, and that there is to be substituted for it a tariff law constructed solely with reference to revenue. That no duty is to be higher because the increase will keep open an American mill or keep up the wages of an American workman, but that in every case such a rate of duty is to be imposed as will bring to the Treasury of the United States the largest returns of revenue. The contention has not been between schedules, but between principles, and it would be offensive to suggest that the prevailing party will not carry into legislation the principles advocated by it and the pledges given to the people. The tariff bills passed by the House of Representatives at the last session were, as I suppose, even in the opinion of their promoters, inadequate, and justified only by the fact that the Senate and House of Representatives were not in accord, and that a general revision could not therefore be undertaken. I recommend that the whole subject of tariff revision be left to the incoming Congress. It is matter of regret that this work must be delayed for at least 3 months, for the threat of great tariff changes introduces so much uncertainty that an amount, not easily estimated, of business inaction and of diminished production will necessarily result. It is possible, also, that this uncertainty may result in decreased revenues from customs duties, for our merchants will make cautious orders for foreign goods in view of the prospect of tariff reductions and the uncertainty as to when they will take effect. Those who have advocated a protective tariff can well afford to have their disastrous forecasts of a change of policy disappointed. If a system of customs duties can be framed that will set the idle wheels and looms of Europe in motion and crowd our warehouses with foreign-made goods and at the same time keep our own mills busy, that will give us an increased participation in the "markets of the world" of greater value than the home market we surrender. That will give increased work to foreign workmen upon products to be consumed by our people without diminishing the amount of work to be done here. That will enable the American manufacturer to pay to his workmen from 50 to 100% more in wages than is paid in the foreign mill, and yet to compete in our market and in foreign markets with the foreign producer. That will further reduce the cost of articles of wear and food without reducing the wages of those who produce them. That can be celebrated after its effects have been realized, as its expectation has been in European as well as in American cities. The authors and promoters of it will be entitled to the highest praise. We have had in our history several experiences of the contrasted effects of a revenue and of a protective tariff, but this generation has not felt them, and the experience of one generation is not highly instructive to the next. The friends of the protective system, with undiminished confidence in the principles they have advocated, will await the results of the new experiment. The strained and too often disturbed relations existing between the employees and the employers in our great manufacturing establishments have not been favorable to a calm consideration by the wage earner of the effect upon wages of the protective system. The facts that his wages were the highest paid in like callings in the world, and that a maintenance of this rate of wages in the absence of protective duties upon the product of his labor was impossible, were obscured by the passion evoked by these contests. He may now be able to review the question in the light of his personal experience under the operation of a tariff for revenue only. If that experience shall demonstrate that present rates of wages are thereby maintained or increased, either absolutely or in their purchasing power, and that the aggregate volume of work to be done in this country is increased or even maintained, so that there are more or as many days' work in a year, at as good or better wages, for the American workmen, as has been the case under the protective system, everyone will rejoice. A general process of wage reduction cannot be contemplated by any patriotic citizen without the gravest apprehension. It may be, indeed I believe is, possible for the American manufacturer to compete successfully with his foreign rival in many branches of production without the defense of protective duties if the pay rolls are equalized. But the conflict that stands between the producer and that result and the distress of our working people when it is attained are not pleasant to contemplate. The Society of the Unemployed, now holding its frequent and threatening parades in the streets of foreign cities, should not be allowed to acquire an American domicile. The reports of the heads of the several executive departments, which are herewith submitted, have very naturally included a resume of the whole work of the administration with the transactions of the last fiscal year. The attention not only of Congress but of the country is again invited to the methods of administration which have been pursued and to the results which have been attained. Public revenues amounting to $1,414,079,292.28 have been collected and dispersed without loss from misappropriation, without a single defalcation of such importance as to attract the public attention, and at a diminished per cent of cost for collection. The public business has been transacted not only with fidelity, but progressively and with a view to giving to the people in the fullest possible degree the benefits of a service established and maintained for their protection and comfort. Our relations with other nations are now undisturbed by any serious controversy. The complicated and threatening differences with Germany and England relating to Samoan affairs, with England in relation to the seal fisheries in the Bering Sea, and with Chile growing out of the Baltimore affair, have been adjusted. There have been negotiated and concluded under Section 3 of the Tariff Law commercial agreements relating to reciprocal trade with the following countries: Brazil, Dominican Republic, Spain for Cuba and Puerto Rico, Guatemala, Salvador, the German Empire, Great Britain for certain West Indian colonies and British Guiana, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Austria-Hungary. Of these, those with Guatemala, Salvador, the German Empire, Great Britain, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Austria-Hungary have been concluded since my last annual message. Under these trade arrangements, a free or favored admission has been secured in every case for an important list of American products. Especial care has been taken to secure markets for farm products, in order to relieve that great underlying industry of the depression which the lack of an adequate foreign market for our surplus often brings. An opening has also been made for manufactured products that will undoubtedly, if this policy is maintained, greatly augment our export trade. The full benefits of these arrangements cannot be realized instantly. New lines of trade are to be opened. The commercial traveler must survey the field. The manufacturer must adapt his goods to the new markets, and facilities for exchange must be established. This work has been well begun, our merchants and manufacturers having entered the new fields with courage and enterprise. In the case of food products, and especially with Cuba, the trade did not need to wait, and the immediate results have been most gratifying. If this policy and these trade arrangements can be continued in force and aided by the establishment of American steamship lines, I do not doubt that we shall within a short period secure fully 1/3 of the total trade of the countries of Central and South America, which now amounts to about $600 million annually. In 1885, we had only 8% of this trade. The following statistics show the increase in our trade with the countries with which we have reciprocal trade agreements from the date when such agreements went into effect up to September 30th, 1892, the increase being in some almost wholly, and in others, in an important degree, the result of these agreements. The domestic exports to Germany and Austria-Hungary have increased in value from $47,673,756 to $57,993,064, an increase of $10,319,308, or 21.63%. With American countries, the value of our exports has increased from $44,160,285 to $54,613,598, an increase of $10,453,313, or 23.67%. The total increase in the value of exports to all the countries with which we have reciprocity agreements has been $20,772,621. This increase is chiefly in wheat, flour, meat, and dairy products, and in manufactures of iron and steel and lumber. There has been a large increase in the value of imports from all these countries since the commercial agreements went into effect, amounting to $74,294,525, but it has been entirely in imports from the American countries, consisting mostly of sugar, coffee, India rubber, and crude drugs. The alarmed attention of our European competitors for the South American market has been attracted to this new American policy and to our acquisition and their loss of South American trade. A treaty providing for the arbitration of the dispute between Great Britain and the United States as to the killing of seals in the Bering Sea was concluded on the 29th of February last. This treaty was accompanied by an agreement prohibiting pelagic sealing pending the arbitration, and a vigorous effort was made during this season to drive out all poaching sealers from the Bering Sea. 6 naval vessels, 3 revenue cutters, and 1 vessel from the Fish Commission, all under the command of Commander Evans of the Navy, were sent into the area, which was systematically patrolled. Some seizures were made, and it is believed that the catch in the Bering Sea by poachers amounted to less than 500 seals. It is true, however, that in the North Pacific, while the seal herds were on their way to the passes between the Aleutian Islands, a very large number, probably 35,000, were taken. The existing statutes of the United States do not restrain our citizens from taking seals in the Pacific Ocean, and perhaps should not unless the prohibition can be extended to the citizens of other nations. I recommend that power be given to the President by proclamation to prohibit the taking of seals in the North Pacific by American vessels in case, either as the result of the findings of the Tribunal of Arbitration or otherwise, the restraints can be applied to the vessels of all countries. The case of the United States for the Tribunal of Arbitration has been prepared with great care and industry by the Hon. John W. Foster, and the counsel who represent this government express confidence that a result substantially establishing our claims and preserving this great industry for the benefit of all nations will be attained. During the past year, a suggestion was received through the British minister that the Canadian government would like to confer as to the possibility of enlarging upon terms of mutual advantage the commercial exchanges of Canada and of the United States, and a conference was held at Washington with Mr. Blaine acting for this government, and the British minister at this capital, and 3 members of the Dominion Cabinet acting as commissioners on the part of Great Britain. The conference developed the fact that the Canadian government was only prepared to offer to the United States, in exchange for the concessions asked, the admission of natural products. The statement was frankly made that favored rates could not be given to the United States, as against the mother country. This admission, which was foreseen, necessarily terminated the conference upon this question. The benefits of an exchange of natural products would be almost wholly with the people of Canada. Some other topics of interest were considered in the conference, and have resulted in the making of a convention for examining the Alaskan boundary and the waters of Passamaquoddy Bay adjacent to Eastport, Maine, and in the initiation of an arrangement for the protection of fish life in the coterminous and neighboring waters of our northern border. The controversy as to tolls upon the Welland Canal, which was presented to Congress at the last session by special message, having failed of adjustment, I felt constrained to exercise the authority conferred by the act of July 26, 1892, and to proclaim a suspension of the free use of St. Mary's Falls Canal to cargoes in transit to ports in Canada. The Secretary of the Treasury established such tolls as were thought to be equivalent to the exactions unjustly levied upon our commerce in the Canadian canals. If, as we must suppose, the political relations of Canada and the disposition of the Canadian government are to remain unchanged, a somewhat radical revision of our trade relations should, I think, be made. Our relations must continue to be intimate, and they should be friendly. I regret to say, however, that in many of the controversies, notably those as to the fisheries on the Atlantic, the sealing interests on the Pacific, and the canal tolls, our negotiations with Great Britain have continuously been thwarted or retarded by unreasonable and unfriendly objections and protests from Canada. In the matter of the canal tolls, our treaty rights were flagrantly disregarded. It is hardly too much to say that the Canadian Pacific and other railway lines which parallel our northern boundary are sustained by commerce having either its origin or terminus, or both, in the United States. Canadian railroads compete with those of the United States for our traffic, and without the restraints of our Interstate Commerce Act. Their cars pass almost without detention into and out of our territory. The Canadian Pacific Railway brought into the United States from China and Japan via British Columbia during the year ended June 30, 1892, 23,239,689 pounds of freight, and it carried from the United States, to be shipped to China and Japan via British Columbia, 24,068,346 pounds of freight. There were also shipped from the United States over this road from eastern ports of the United States to our Pacific ports during the same year 13,912,073 pounds of freight, and there were received over this road at the United States eastern ports from ports on the Pacific coast 13,293,315 pounds of freight. Mr. Joseph Nemo, Jr., former chief of the Bureau of Statistics, when before the Senate Select Committee on Relations with Canada, April 26, 1890, said that, quote, "The value of goods thus transported between different points in the United States across Canadian territory probably amounts to $100 million a year." Unquote. There is no disposition on the part of the people or government of the United States to interfere in the smallest degree with the political relations of Canada. That question is wholly with her own people. It is time for us, however, to consider whether, if the present state of things and trend of things is to continue, our interchanges upon lines of land transportation should not be put upon a different basis, and our entire independence of Canadian canals and of the St. Lawrence as an outlet to the sea secured by the construction of an American canal around the Falls of Niagara, and the opening of ship communication between the Great Lakes and one of our own seaports. We should not hesitate to avail ourselves of our great natural trade advantages. We should withdraw the support which is given to the railroads and steamship lines of Canada by a traffic that properly belongs to us, and no longer furnish the earnings which lighten the otherwise crushing weight of the enormous public subsidies that have been given to them. The subject of the power of the Treasury to deal with this matter without further legislation has been under consideration, but circumstances have postponed a conclusion. It is probable that a consideration of the propriety of a modification or abrogation of the article of the Treaty of Washington relating to the transit of goods in bond is involved in any complete solution of the question. Congress at the last session was kept advised of the progress of the serious and, for a time, threatening difference between the United States and Chile. It gives me now great gratification to report that the Chilean government, in a most friendly and honorable spirit, has tendered and paid as an indemnity to the families of the sailors of the Baltimore who were killed and to those who were injured in the outbreak in the city of Valparaiso the sum of $75,000. This has been accepted not only as an indemnity for a wrong done, but as a most gratifying evidence that the government of Chile rightly appreciates the disposition of this government to act in a spirit of the most absolute fairness and friendliness in our intercourse with that brave people. A further and conclusive evidence of the mutual respect and confidence now existing is furnished by the fact that a convention submitting to arbitration the mutual claims of the citizens of the respective governments has been agreed upon. Some of these claims have been pending for many years and have been the occasion of much unsatisfactory diplomatic correspondence. I have endeavored in every way to assure our sister republics of Central and South America that the United States government and its people have only the most friendly disposition toward them all. We do not covet their territory. We have no disposition to be oppressive or exacting in our dealings with any of them, even the weakest. Our interests and our hopes for them all lie in the direction of stable governments by their people and of the largest development of their great commercial resources. The mutual benefits of enlarged commercial exchanges and of a more familiar and friendly intercourse between our peoples we do desire, and in this have sought their friendly cooperation. I have believed, however, while holding these sentiments in the greatest sincerity, that we must insist upon a just responsibility for any injuries inflicted upon our official representatives or upon our citizens. This insistence, kindly and justly but firmly made, will, I believe, promote peace and mutual respect. Our relations with Hawaii have been such as to attract an increased interest, and must continue to do so. I deem it of great importance that the projected submarine cable, a survey for which has been made, should be promoted. Both for naval and commercial uses we should have quick communication with Honolulu. We should before this have availed ourselves of the concession made many years ago to this government for a harbor and naval station at Pearl River. Many evidences of the friendliness of the Hawaiian government have been given in the past, and it is gratifying to believe that the advantage and necessity of a continuance of very close relations is appreciated. The friendly act of this government in expressing to the government of Italy its reprobation and abhorrence of the lynching of Italian subjects in New Orleans by the payment of 125,000 francs, or $24,330.90, was accepted by the King of Italy with every manifestation of gracious appreciation, and the incident has been highly promotive of mutual respect and goodwill. In consequence of the action of the French government in proclaiming a protectorate over certain tribal districts of the west coast of Africa, eastward of the San Pedro River, which has long been regarded as the southeastern boundary of Liberia, I have felt constrained to make protest against this encroachment upon the territory of a republic which was founded by citizens of the United States, and toward which this country has for many years held the intimate relation of a friendly counselor. The recent disturbances of the public peace by lawless foreign marauders on the Mexican frontier have afforded this government an opportunity to testify its good will for Mexico and its earnest purpose to fulfill the obligations of international friendship by pursuing and dispersing the evildoers. The work of relocating the boundary of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo westward from El Paso is progressing favorably. Our intercourse with Spain continues on a friendly footing. I regret, however, not to be able to report as yet the adjustment of the claims of the American missionaries arising from the disorders at Ponape in the Caroline Islands. But I anticipate a satisfactory adjustment in view of renewed and urgent representations to the government at Madrid. The treatment of the religious and educational establishments of American citizens in Turkey has of late called for a more than usual share of attention. A tendency to curtail the toleration which has so beneficially prevailed is discernible, and has called forth the earnest remonstrance of this government. Harassing regulations in regard to schools and churches have been attempted in certain localities, but not without due protest and the assertion of the inherent and conventional rights of our countrymen. Violations of domicile and search of the persons and effects of citizens of the United States by apparently irresponsible officials in the Asiatic vilayets have from time to time been reported. An aggravated instance of injury to the property of an American missionary at Burdur in the province of Konya called forth an urgent claim for reparation, which I am pleased to say was promptly heeded by the government of the Porte. Interference with the trading ventures of our citizens in Asia Minor is also reported, and the lack of consular representation in that region is a serious drawback to instant and effective protection. I cannot believe that these incidents represent a settled policy, and shall not cease to urge the adoption of proper remedies. International copyright has been extended to Italy by proclamation in conformity with the Act of March 3, 1891, upon assurance being given that Italian law permits to citizens of the United States the benefit of copyright on substantially the same basis as to subjects of Italy. By a special convention proclaimed January 15, 1892, reciprocal provisions of copyright have been applied between the United States and Germany. Negotiations are in progress with other countries to the same end. I repeat with great earnestness the recommendation which I have made in several previous messages, that prompt and adequate support be given to the American company engaged in the construction of the Nicaragua ship canal. It is impossible to overstate the value from every standpoint of this great enterprise, and I hope that there may be time, even in this Congress, to give to it an impetus that will ensure the early completion of the canal and secure to the United States its proper relation to it when completed. The Congress has been already advised that the invitations of this government for the assembling of an international monetary conference to consider the question of an enlarged use of silver were accepted by the nations to which they were addressed. The conference assembled at Brussels on the 22nd of November and has entered upon the consideration of this great question. I have not doubted, and have taken occasion to express that belief, as well in the invitations issued for this conference as in my public messages, that the free coinage of silver upon an agreed international ratio would greatly promote the interests of our people and equally those of other nations. It is too early to predict what results may be accomplished by the conference. If any temporary check or delay intervenes, I believe that very soon commercial conditions will compel the now reluctant governments to unite with us in this movement to secure the enlargement of the volume of coined money needed for the transaction of the business of the world. The report of the Secretary of the Treasury will attract especial interest in view of the many misleading statements that have been made as to the state of the public revenues. 3 preliminary facts should not only be stated but emphasized before looking into details. First, that the public debt has been reduced since March 4, 1889, $259,074,200, and the annual interest charge $11,684,469. Second, that there have been paid out for pensions during this administration up to November 1, 1892, $432,564,178.70, an excess of $114,466,300 $386.09 over the sum expended during the period from March 1st, 1885 to March 1st, 1889. And third, that under the existing tariff up to December 1st, about $93 million of revenue, which would have been collected upon imported sugars if the duty had been maintained, has gone into the pockets of the people and not into the public treasury as before. If there are any who still think that the surplus should have been kept out of circulation by hoarding it in the treasury, or deposited in favored banks without interest, while the government continued to pay to these very banks interest upon the bonds deposited as security for the deposits, or who think that the extended pension legislation was a public robbery, or that the duties upon sugar should have been maintained, I am content to leave the argument where it now rests, while we wait to see whether these criticisms will take the form of legislation. The revenues for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 1892, from all sources were $425,868,260.22, and the expenditures for all purposes were $415,953,806.56, leaving a balance of $9,914,453.66. There were paid during the year upon the public debt $40,570,467.98. The surplus in the Treasury and the Bank Redemption Fund passed by the act of July 14, 1890, to the general fund furnished in large part the cash available and used for the payments made upon the public debt. Compared with the year 1891, our receipts from customs duties fell off $42,069,241.08, while our receipts from internal revenue increased $8,284,823.13, leaving the net loss of revenue from these principal sources $33,784,417.95. The net loss of revenue from all sources was $32,675,972.81. The revenues, estimated and actual, for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 1893, are placed by the Secretary at $463,336,350.44, and the expenditures at $461,336,350.44, showing a surplus of receipts over expenditures of $2 million. The cash balance in the Treasury at the end of the fiscal year, it is estimated, will be $20,992,377.03. So far as these figures are based upon estimates of receipts and expenditures for the remaining months of the current fiscal year, there are not only the usual elements of uncertainty, but some added elements. New revenue legislation, or even the expectation of it, may seriously reduce the public revenues during the period of uncertainty, and during the process of business adjustment to the new conditions when they become known. But the Secretary has very wisely refrained from guessing as to the effect of possible changes in our revenue laws, since the scope of those changes and the time of their taking effect cannot in any degree be forecast or foretold by him. His estimates must be based upon existing laws and upon a continuance of existing business conditions, except so far as these conditions may be affected by causes other than new legislation. The estimated receipts for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 1894 are $490,121,365.38, and the estimated appropriations $457,261,335.33, leaving an estimated surplus of receipts over expenditures of $32,860,030.05. This does not include any payment to the sinking fund. In the recommendation of the Secretary that the sinking fund law be repealed, I concur. The redemption of bonds since the passage of the law to June 30, 1892, has already exceeded the requirements by the sum of $990,510,681.49. The retirement of bonds in the future, before maturity, should be a matter of convenience, not of compulsion. We should not collect revenue for that purpose, but only use any casual surplus. To the balance of $32,860,030.05 of receipts over expenditures for the year 1894 should be added the estimated surplus at the beginning of the year, $20,992,377.03, and from this aggregate there must be deducted, as stated by the Secretary, about $44 million of estimated unexpected appropriations. The public confidence in the purpose and ability of the Government to maintain the parity of all our money issues, whether coin or paper, must remain unshaken. The demand for gold in Europe and the consequent calls upon us are in a considerable degree the result of the efforts of some of the European governments to increase their gold reserves, and these efforts should be met by appropriate legislation on our part. The conditions that have created this drain of the Treasury gold are in an important degree political and not commercial. In view of the fact that a general revision of our revenue laws in the near future seems to be probable, it would be better that any changes should be a part of that revision rather than of a temporary nature. During the last fiscal year the Secretary purchased under the Act of July 14, 1890, 54,355,748 ounces of silver, and issued in payment therefor $51,106,608 in notes. The total purchases since the passage of the Act have been 120,479,981 ounces, and the aggregate of notes issued $116,783,590. The average price paid for silver during the year was 94 cents per ounce, the highest price being $1.0275 July 1, 1891, and the lowest 83 cents March 21, 1892. In view of the fact that the Monetary Conference is now sitting and that no conclusion has yet been reached, I withhold any recommendation as to legislation upon this subject.
End of Part 1 of President Benjamin Harrison's last State of the Union Address, delivered December 6, 1892. Read by John Greenman. This is Section 29 of Presidential Farewell and Last Addresses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. President Benjamin Harrison's last State of the Union Address, December 6, 1892, Part 2, read by John Greenman.
The report of the Secretary of War brings again to the attention of Congress some important suggestions as to the reorganization of the infantry and artillery arms of the service, which his predecessors have before urgently presented. Our army is small, but its organization should all the more be put upon the most approved modern basis. The conditions upon what we have called the frontier have heretofore required the maintenance of many small posts, but now the policy of concentration is obviously the right one. The new posts should have the proper strategic relations to the only frontiers we now have, those of the sea-coast and of our northern and part of our southern boundary. I do not think that any question of advantage to localities or to states should determine the location of the new posts. The reorganization and enlargement of the Bureau of Military Information, which the Secretary has effected, is a work the usefulness of which will become every year more apparent. The work of building heavy guns and the construction of coast defenses has been well begun and should be carried on without check. The report of the Attorney General is by law submitted directly to Congress, but I cannot refrain from saying that he has conducted the increasing work of the Department of Justice with great professional skill. He has, in several directions, secured from the courts decisions giving increased protection to the officers of the United States, and bringing some classes of crime that escaped local cognizance and punishment into the tribunals of the United States, where they could be tried with impartiality. The numerous applications of executive clemency presented in behalf of persons convicted in United States courts and given penitentiary sentences have called my attention to a fact referred to by the Attorney General in his report, namely, that a time allowance for good behavior for such prisoners is prescribed by the federal statutes only where the state in which the penitentiary is located has made no such provision. Prisoners are given the benefit of the provisions of the state law regulating the penitentiary to which they may be sent. These are various, some perhaps too liberal and some perhaps too illiberal. The result is that a sentence for 5 years means one thing if the prisoner is sent to one state for confinement, and quite a different thing if he is sent to another. I recommend that a uniform credit for good behavior be prescribed by Congress. I have before expressed my concurrence in the recommendation of the Attorney General that degrees of murder should be recognized in the federal statutes, as they are, I believe, in all the states. These grades are rounded on correct distinctions in crime. The recognition of them would enable the courts to exercise some discretion in apportioning punishment, and would greatly relieve the executive of what is coming to be a very heavy burden, the examination of these cases on application for commutation. The aggregate of claims pending against the government in the Court of Claims is enormous. Claims to the amount of nearly $400 million for the taking of or injury to the property of persons claiming to be loyal during the war are now before that court for examination. When to these are added the Indian depredation claims and the French spoliation claims, an aggregate is reached that is indeed startling. In the defense of all these cases the government is at great disadvantage. The claimants have preserved their evidence, whereas the agents of the government are sent into the field to rummage for what they can find. This difficulty is peculiarly great where the fact to be established is the disloyalty of the claimant during the war. If this great threat against our revenues is to have no other check, certainly Congress should supply the Department of Justice with appropriations sufficiently liberal to secure the best legal talent in the defense of these claims and to pursue its vague search for evidence effectively. The report of the Postmaster General shows a most gratifying increase and a most efficient and progressive management of the great business of that department. The remarkable increase in revenues, in the number of post offices, and in the miles of mail carriage furnishes further evidence of the high state of prosperity which our people are enjoying. New offices mean new hamlets and towns. New routes mean the extension of our border settlements, and increased revenues mean an active commerce. The Postmaster General reviews the whole period of his administration of the office and brings some of his statistics down to the month of November last. The postal revenues have increased during the last year nearly $5 million. The deficit for the year ending June 30th, 1892, is $848,341 less than the deficiency of the preceding year. The deficiency of the present fiscal year, it is estimated, will be reduced to $1,552,423, which will not only be extinguished during the next fiscal year, but a surplus of nearly $1 million should then be shown. In these calculations the payments to be made under the contracts for ocean mail service have not been included. There have been added 1,590 new mail routes during the year, with a mileage of 8,563 miles,
and the total number of new miles of mail trips added during the year is nearly 17 million. The number of miles of mail journeys added during the last 4 years is about 76 million, this addition being 21 million miles more than were in operation in the whole country in 1861. The number of post offices has been increased by 2,790 during the year, and during the past 4 years, and up to October 29 last, the total increase in the number of offices has been nearly 9,000. The number of free delivery offices has been nearly doubled in the last 4 years, and the number of money order offices more than doubled within that time. For the 3 years ending June 30, 1892, the postal revenue amounted to $197,744,359, which was an increase of $52,263,150 over the revenue for the 3 years ending June 30, 1888, the increase during the last 3 years being more than 3.5 times as great as the increase during the 3 years ending June 30, 1888. No such increase as that shown for these 3 years has ever previously appeared in the revenues of the Department. The Postmaster General has extended to the post offices in the larger cities the merit system of promotion introduced by my direction into the departments here, and it has resulted there, as in the departments, in a larger volume of work, and that better done. Ever since our merchant marine was driven from the sea by the rebel cruisers during the War of the Rebellion, the United States has been paying an enormous annual tribute to foreign countries in the shape of freight and passage moneys. Our grain and meats have been taken at our own docks, and our large imports there laid down by foreign shipmasters. An increasing torrent of American travel to Europe has contributed a vast sum annually to the dividends of foreign ship owners. The balance of trade shown by the books of our custom houses has been very largely reduced, and in many years altogether extinguished by this constant drain. In the year 1892, only 12.3% of our imports were brought in American vessels. These great foreign steamships maintained by our traffic are many of them under contracts with their respective governments, by which, in time of war, they will become a part of their armed naval establishments. Profiting by our commerce in peace, they will become the most formidable destroyers of our commerce in time of war. I have felt, and have before expressed the feeling, that this condition of things was both intolerable and disgraceful. A wholesome change of policy, and one having in it much promise, as it seems to me, was begun by the law of March 3, 1891. Under this law contracts have been made by the Postmaster General for 11 mail routes. The expenditure involved by these contracts for the next fiscal year approximates $954,123.33. As one of the results already reached, 16 American steamships, of an aggregate tonnage of 57,400 tons, costing $7,400,000, have been built or contracted to be built in American shipyards. The estimated tonnage of all steamships required under existing contracts is 165,802, and when the full service required by these contracts is established, there will be 41 mail steamers under the American flag, with the probability of further necessary additions in the Brazilian and Argentine service. The contracts recently let for transatlantic service will result in the construction of 5 ships of 10,000 tons each, costing $9 million to $10 million, and will add, with the City of New York and City of Paris, to which the Treasury Department was authorized by legislation at the last session to give American registry 7 of the swiftest vessels upon the sea to our naval reserve. The contracts made with the lines sailing to Central and South American ports have increased the frequency and shortened the time of the trips, added new ports of call, and sustained some lines that otherwise would almost certainly have been withdrawn.
The service to Buenos Aires is the first to the Argentine Republic under the American flag. The service to Southampton, Boulogne, and Antwerp is also new, and is to be begun with the steamships City of New York and City of Paris in February next. I earnestly urge the continuance of the policy inaugurated by this legislation, and that the appropriations required to meet the obligations of the government under the contracts may be made promptly, so that the lines that have entered into these engagements may not be embarrassed. We have had, by reason of connections with the transcontinental railway lines constructed through our own territory, some advantages in the ocean trade of the Pacific that we did not possess on the Atlantic. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway and the establishment under large subventions from Canada and England of fast steamship service from Vancouver with Japan and China seriously threaten our shipping interests in the Pacific. This line of English steamers receives, as is stated by the Commissioner of Navigation, a direct subsidy of $400,000 annually, or $30,767 per trip for 13 voyages, in addition to some further aid from the Admiralty in connection with contracts under which the vessels may be used for naval purposes. The competing American Pacific Mail Line under the Act of March 3, 1891, receives only $6,389 per round trip. Efforts have been making within the last year, as I am informed, to establish under similar conditions a line between Vancouver and some Australian port, with a view of seizing there a trade in which we have had a large interest. The Commissioner of Navigation states that a very large percent of our imports from Asia are now brought to us by English steamships and their connecting railways in Canada. With a view of promoting this trade, especially in tea, Canada has imposed a discriminating duty of 10% upon tea and coffee brought into the Dominion from the United States. If this unequal contest between American lines without subsidy or with diminished subsidies and the English-Canadian line to which I have referred is to continue, I think we should at least see that the facilities for customs entry and transportation across our territory are not such as to make the Canadian route a favored one, and that the discrimination as to duties to which I have referred is met by a like discrimination as to the importation of these articles from Canada. No subject, I think, more nearly touches the pride, the power, and the prosperity of our country than this of the development of our merchant marine upon the sea. If we could enter into conference with other competitors and all would agree to withhold government aid, we could perhaps take our chances with the rest. But our great competitors have established and maintained their lines by government subsidies until they now have practically excluded us from participation. In my opinion, no choice is left to us but to pursue, moderately at least, the same lines. The report of the Secretary of the Navy exhibits great progress in the construction of our new Navy. When the present Secretary entered upon his duties, only 3 modern steel vessels were in commission. The vessels since put in commission and to be put in commission during the winter will make a total of 19 during his administration of the department. During the current year 10 war vessels and 3 Navy tugs have been launched, and during the 4 years 25 vessels will have been launched. 2 other large ships and a torpedo boat are under contract, and the work upon them well advanced, and the 4 monitors are awaiting only the arrival of their armor, which has been unexpectedly delayed, or they would have been before this in commission. Contracts have been let during this administration under the appropriations for the increase of the Navy, including new vessels and their appurtenances, to the amount of $35 million, and there has been expected during the same period for labor at Navy yards upon similar work $8 million without the smallest scandal or charge of fraud or partiality. The enthusiasm and interest of our naval officers, both of the staff and line, have been greatly kindled.
They have responded magnificently to the confidence of Congress, and have demonstrated to the world an unexcelled capacity in construction, in ordnance, and in everything involved in the building, equipping, and sailing of great war ships. At the beginning of Secretary Tracy's administration, several difficult problems remained to be grappled with and solved before the efficiency in action of our ships could be secured. It is believed that as a result of new processes in the construction of armor plate, our later ships will be clothed with defensive plates of higher resisting power than are found on any war vessels afloat. We were without torpedoes. Tests have been made to ascertain the relative efficiency of different constructions. A torpedo has been adopted, and the work of construction is now being carried on successfully. We were without armor-piercing shells, and without a shop instructed and equipped for the construction of them. We are now making what is believed to be a projectile superior to any before in use. A smokeless powder has been developed, and a slow-burning powder for guns of large caliber. A high explosive capable of use in shells fired from service guns has been found, and the manufacture of gun cotton has been developed so that the question of supply is no longer in doubt. The development of a naval militia, which has been organized in 8 states and brought into cordial and cooperative relations with the Navy, is another important achievement. There are now enlisted in these organizations 1,800 men, and they are likely to be greatly extended. I recommend such legislation and appropriations as will encourage and develop this movement. The recommendations of the Secretary will, I do not doubt, receive the friendly consideration of Congress, for he has enjoyed, as he has deserved, the confidence of all those interested in the development of our Navy, without any division upon partisan lines. I earnestly express the hope that a work which has made such noble progress may not now be stayed. The wholesome influence for peace and the increased sense of security which our citizens domiciled in other lands feel when these magnificent ships under the American flag appear is already most gratefully apparent. The ships from our Navy which will appear in the great naval parade next April in the harbor of New York will be a convincing demonstration to the world that the United States is again a naval power. The work of the Interior Department, always very burdensome, has been larger than ever before during the administration of Secretary Noble. The disability pension law, the taking of the 11th census, the opening of vast areas of Indian lands to settlement, the organization of Oklahoma, and the negotiations for the cession of Indian lands furnish some of the particulars of the increased work, and the results achieved testify to the ability, fidelity, and industry of the head of the Department and his efficient assistants. Several important agreements for the cession of Indian lands negotiated by the Commission appointed under the Act of March 2, 1889, are awaiting the action of Congress. Perhaps the most important of these is that for the cession of the Cherokee Strip. This region has been the source of great vexation to the Executive Department and of great friction and unrest between the settlers who desire to occupy it and the Indians who assert title. The agreement which has been made by the Commission is perhaps the most satisfactory that could have been reached. It will be noticed that it is conditioned upon its ratification by Congress before March 4, 1893. The Secretary of the Interior, who has given the subject very careful thought, recommends the ratification of the agreement, and I am inclined to follow his recommendation. Certain it is that some action by which this controversy shall be brought to an end, and these lands opened to settlement, is urgent. The form of government provided by Congress on May 17, 1884, for Alaska was in its frame and purpose temporary. The increase of population and the development of some important mining and commercial interests make it imperative that the law should be revised and better provision made for the arrest and punishment of criminals.
The report of the Secretary shows a very gratifying state of facts as to the condition of the General Land Office. The work of issuing agricultural patents, which seemed to be hopelessly in arrear when the present Secretary undertook the duties of his office, has been so expedited that the Bureau is now upon current business. The relief thus afforded to honest and worthy settlers upon the public lands by giving to them an assured title to their entries has been of incalculable benefit in developing the new States and the Territories. The Court of Private Land Claims, established by Congress for the promotion of this policy of speedily settling contested land titles, is making satisfactory progress in its work, and when the work is completed a great impetus will be given to the development of those regions where unsettled claims under Mexican grants have so long exercised their repressive influence. When to these results are added the enormous cessions of Indian lands which have been opened to settlement, aggregating during this administration nearly 26 million acres, and the agreements negotiated and now pending in Congress for ratification by which about 10 million additional acres will be opened to settlement, it will be seen how much has been accomplished. The work in the Indian Bureau in the execution of the policy of recent legislation has been largely directed to two chief purposes. First, the allotment of lands in severalty to the Indians and the cession to the United States of the surplus lands, and secondly, to the work of educating the Indian for his own protection in his closer contact with the white man and for the intelligent exercise of his new citizenship. Allotments have been made and patents issued to 5,900 Indians under the present Secretary and Commissioner, and 7,600 additional allotments have been made for which patents are now in process of preparation. The school attendance of Indian children has been increased during that time over 13%, the enrollment for 1892 being nearly 20,000. A uniform system of school textbooks and of study has been adopted, and the work in these national schools brought as near as may be to the basis of the free common schools of the States. These schools can be transferred and merged into the common school systems of the States when the Indian has fully assumed his new relation to the organized civil community in which he resides, and the new States are able to assume the burden. I have several times been called upon to remove Indian agents appointed by me, and have done so promptly upon every sustained complaint of unfitness or misconduct. I believe, however, that the Indian service at the agencies has been improved, and is now administered on the whole with a good degree of efficiency. If any legislation is possible by which the selection of Indian agents can be wholly removed from all partisan suggestions or considerations, I am sure it would be a great relief to the Executive and a great benefit to the service. The appropriation for the subsistence of the Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians, made at the last session of Congress, was inadequate. This smaller appropriation was estimated for by the Commissioner upon the theory that the large fund belonging to the tribe in the public treasury could be and ought to be used for their support. In view, however, of the pending depredation claims against this fund and other considerations, the Secretary of the Interior on the 12th of April last submitted a supplemental estimate for $50,000. This appropriation was not made, as it should have been, and the oversight ought to be remedied at the earliest possible date. In a special message to this Congress at the last session, I stated the reasons why I had not approved the deed for the release to the United States by the Choctaws and the Chickasaws of the lands formerly embraced in the Cheyenne and Arapaho Reservation, and remaining after allotments to that tribe. A resolution of the Senate expressing the opinion of that body that, notwithstanding the facts stated in my special message, the deed should be approved and the money, $2,991,450, paid over, was presented to me May 10, 1892. My special message was intended to call the attention of Congress to the subject, and in view of the fact that it is conceded that the appropriation proceeded upon a false basis as to the amount of lands to be paid for, and is by $50,000 in excess of the amount they are entitled to, even if their claim to the land is given full recognition at the rate agreed upon, I have not felt willing to approve the deed, and shall not do so, at least until both Houses of Congress have acted upon the subject. It has been informally proposed by the claimants to release this sum of $50,000, but I have no power to demand or accept such a release, and such an agreement would be without consideration and void. I desire further to call the attention of Congress to the fact that the recent agreement concluded with the Kiowas and Comanches relates to lands which were a part of the leased district, and to which the claim of the Choctaws and Chickasaws is precisely that recognized by Congress in the legislation I have referred to. The surplus lands to which this claim would attach in the Kiowa and Comanche Reservation is 2,500,000 acres, and at the same rate the government will be called upon to pay to the Choctaws and Chickasaws for these lands $3,125,000. This sum will be further augmented, especially if the title of the Indians to the tract now Greet County, Texas, is established. The duty devolved upon me in this connection was simply to pass upon the form of the deed, but as, in my opinion, the facts mentioned in my special message were not adequately brought to the attention of Congress in connection with the legislation, I have felt that I would not be justified in acting without some new expression of the legislative will. The report of the Commissioner of Pensions, to which extended notice is given by the Secretary of the Interior in his report, will attract great attention. Judged by the aggregate amount of work done, the last year has been the greatest in the history of the office. I believe that the organization of the office is efficient, and that the work has been done with fidelity. The passage of what is known as the Disability Bill has, as was foreseen, very largely increased the annual disbursements to the disabled veterans of the Civil War. The estimate for this fiscal year was $144,956,000, and that amount was appropriated. A deficiency amounting to $10,508,621 must be provided for at this session. The estimate for pensions for the fiscal year ending June 30, 1894, is $165 million. The Commissioner of Pensions believes that if the present legislation and methods are maintained and further additions to the pension laws are not made, the maximum expenditure for pensions will be reached June 30, 1894, and will be at the highest point $188 million per annum. I adhere to the views expressed in previous messages that the care of the disabled soldiers of the War of the Rebellion is a matter of national concern and duty. Perhaps no emotion cools sooner than that of gratitude, but I can not believe that this process has yet reached a point with our people that would sustain the policy of remitting the care of these disabled veterans to the inadequate agencies provided by local laws. The parade on the 20th of September last upon the streets of this capital of 60,000 of the surviving Union veterans of the War of the Rebellion was a most touching and thrilling episode, and the rich and gracious welcome extended to them by the District of Columbia, and the applause that greeted their progress from tens of thousands of people from all the States, did much to revive the glorious recollections of the grand review when these men and many thousand others, now in their graves, were welcomed with grateful joy as victors in a struggle in which the national unity, honor, and wealth were all at issue. In my last annual message I called attention to the fact that some legislative action was necessary in order to protect the interests of the government in its relations with the Union Pacific Railway. The Commissioner of Railroads has submitted a very full report.
giving exact information as to the debt, the liens upon the company's property, and its resources. We must deal with the question as we find it, and take that course which will under existing conditions best secure the interests of the United States. I recommended in my last annual message that a commission be appointed to deal with this question, and I renew that recommendation and suggest that the commission be given full power. The report of the Secretary of Agriculture contains not only a most interesting statement of the progressive and valuable work done under the administration of Secretary Rusk, but many suggestions for the enlarged usefulness of this important department. In the successful efforts to break down the restrictions to the free introduction of our meat products in the countries of Europe, the Secretary has been untiring from the first, stimulating and aiding all other government officers, at home and abroad, whose official duties enabled them to participate in the work. The total trade in hog products with Europe in May 1892 amounted to £82 million, against $46,900,000 in the same month of 1891. In June 1892, the export aggregated £85,700,000, against £46,500 in the same month of the previous year. In July there was an increase of 41%, and in August of 55% over the corresponding months of 1891. Over 40 million pounds of inspected pork have been exported since the law was put into operation, and a comparison of the 4 months of May, June, July, and August 1892 with the same months of 1891 shows an increase in the number of pounds of our export of pork products of 62%, and an increase in value of 66.5%. The exports of dressed beef increased from £137,900,000 in 1889 to £220,500,000 in 1892, or about 60%. During the past year there have been exported 394,607 head of live cattle, as against 205,786 exported in 1889. This increased exportation has been largely promoted by the inspection authorized by law and the faithful efforts of the Secretary and his efficient subordinates to make that inspection thorough, and to carefully exclude from all cargoes diseased or suspected cattle. The requirement of the English regulations that live cattle arriving from the United States must be slaughtered at the docks had its origin in the claim that pleuropneumonia existed among American cattle, and that the existence of the disease could only certainly be determined by a post-mortem inspection. The Department of Agriculture has labored with great energy and faithfulness to extirpate this disease, and on the 26th day of September last a public announcement was made by the Secretary that the disease no longer existed anywhere within the United States. He is entirely satisfied, after the most searching inquiry, that this statement was justified, and that by a continuance of the inspection and quarantine now required of cattle brought into this country, the disease can be prevented from again getting any foothold. The value to the cattle industry of the United States of this achievement can hardly be estimated. We cannot perhaps at once insist that this evidence shall be accepted as satisfactory by other countries, but if the present exemption from the disease is maintained, and the inspection of our cattle arriving at foreign ports, in which our own veterinarians participate, confirms it, we may justly expect that the requirement that our cattle shall be slaughtered at the docks will be revoked, as the sanitary restrictions upon our pork products have been. If our cattle can be taken alive to the interior, the trade will be enormously increased. Agricultural products constituted 78.1% of our unprecedented exports for the fiscal year which closed June 30, 1892, the total exports being $1,030,278,030, and the value of the agricultural products $793,717,676, which exceeds by more than $150 million the shipment of agricultural products in any previous year. An interesting and a promising work for the benefit of the American farmer has been begun through agents of the Agricultural Department in Europe, and consists in efforts to introduce the various products of Indian corn as articles of human food. The high price of rye offered a favorable opportunity for the experiment in Germany of combining corn meal with rye to produce a cheaper bread. A fair degree of success has been attained, and some mills for grinding corn for food have been introduced. The Secretary is of the opinion that this new use of the products of corn has already stimulated exportations, and that if diligently prosecuted, large and important markets can presently be opened for this great American product. The suggestions of the Secretary for an enlargement of the work of the Department are commended to your favorable consideration. It may, I think, be said without challenge that in no corresponding period has so much been done as during the last 4 years for the benefit of American agriculture. The subject of quarantine regulations, inspection, and control was brought suddenly to my attention by the arrival at our ports in August last of vessels infected with cholera. Quarantine regulations should be uniform at all our ports. Under the Constitution they are plainly within the exclusive federal jurisdiction when and so far as Congress shall legislate. In my opinion, the whole subject should be taken into national control and adequate power given to the executive to protect our people against plague invasions. On the 1st of September last I approved regulations establishing a 20-day quarantine for all vessels bringing immigrants from foreign ports. This order will be continued in force. Some loss and suffering have resulted to passengers, but a due care for the homes of our people justifies in such cases the utmost precaution. There is danger that with the coming of spring cholera will again appear, and a liberal appropriation should be made at this session to enable our quarantine and port officers to exclude the deadly plague. But the most careful and stringent quarantine regulations may not be sufficient absolutely to exclude the disease. The progress of medical and sanitary science has been such, however, that if approved precautions are taken at once to put all of our cities and towns in the best sanitary condition, and provision is made for isolating any sporadic cases and for a thorough disinfection, an epidemic can, I am sure, be avoided. This work appertains to the local authorities, and the responsibility and the penalty will be appalling if it is neglected or unduly delayed. We are peculiarly subject in our great ports to the spread of infectious diseases by reason of the fact that unrestricted immigration brings to us out of European cities, in the overcrowded steerages of great steamships, a large number of persons whose surroundings make them the easy victims of the plague. This consideration, as well as those affecting the political, moral, and industrial interests of our country, leads me to renew the suggestion that admission to our country and to the high privileges of its citizenship should be more restricted and more careful. We have, I think, a right and owe a duty to our own people, and especially to our working people, not only to keep out the vicious, the ignorant, the civil disturber, the pauper, and the contract laborer, but to check the too great flow of immigration now coming by further limitations. The report of the World's Columbian Exposition has not yet been submitted. That of the Board of Management of the Government exhibit has been received and is herewith transmitted. The work of construction and of preparation for the opening of the Exposition in May next has progressed most satisfactorily, and upon a scale of liberality and magnificence that will worthily sustain the honor of the United States. The District of Columbia is left by a decision of the Supreme Court of the District without any law regulating the liquor traffic. An old statute of the legislature of the district relating to the licensing of various vocations has hitherto been treated by the commissioners as giving them power to grant or refuse licenses to sell intoxicating liquors, and as subjecting those who sold without licenses to penalties. But in May last the Supreme Court of the District held against this view of the powers of the Commissioners. It is of urgent importance, therefore, that Congress should supply, either by direct enactment or by conferring discretionary powers upon the Commissioners, proper limitations and restraints upon the liquor traffic in the District. The District has suffered in its reputation by many crimes of violence, a large per cent of them resulting from drunkenness and the liquor traffic. The capital of the nation should be freed from this reproach by the enactment of stringent restrictions and limitations upon the traffic. In renewing the recommendation which I have made in 3 preceding annual messages that Congress should legislate for the protection of railroad employees against the dangers incident to the old and inadequate methods of braking and coupling which are still in use upon freight trains, I do so with the hope that this Congress may take action upon the subject. Statistics furnished by the Interstate Commerce Commission show that during the year ending June 30, 1891, there were 47 different styles of car couplers reported to be in use, and that during the same period there were 2,660 employees killed and 26,140 injured. Nearly 16% of the deaths occurred in the coupling and uncoupling of cars, and over 36% of the injuries had the same origin. The Civil Service Commission asked for an increased appropriation for needed clerical assistance, which I think should be given. I extended the classified service March 1, 1892, to include physicians, superintendents, assistant superintendents, school teachers, and matrons in the Indian service, and have had under consideration the subject of some further extensions, but have not as yet fully determined the lines upon which extensions can most properly and usefully be made. I have in each of the 3 annual messages, which it has been my duty to submit to Congress, called attention to the evils and dangers connected with our election methods and practices as they are related to the choice of officers of the national government. In my last annual message I endeavored to invoke serious attention to the evils of unfair apportionments for Congress. I cannot close this message without again calling attention to these grave and threatening evils. I had hoped that it was possible to secure a nonpartisan inquiry by means of a commission into evils the existence of which is known to all, and that out of this might grow legislation from which all thought of partisan advantage should be eliminated, and only the higher thought appeared of maintaining the freedom and purity of the ballot and the equality of the elector, without the guarantee of which the government could never have been formed, and without the continuance of which it cannot continue to exist in peace and prosperity. It is time that mutual charges of unfairness and fraud between the great parties should cease, and that the sincerity of those who profess a desire for pure and honest elections should be brought to the test of their willingness to free our legislation and our election methods from everything that tends to impair the public confidence in the announced result. The necessity for an inquiry and for legislation by Congress upon this subject is emphasized by the fact that the tendency of the legislation in some states in recent years has in some important particulars been away from and not toward free and fair elections and equal apportionments. Is it not time that we should come together upon the high plane of patriotism, while we devise methods that shall secure the right of every man qualified by law to cast a free ballot, and give to every such ballot an equal value in choosing our public officers and in directing the policy of the government? Lawlessness is not less such, but more, where it usurps the functions of the peace officer and of the courts. The frequent lynching of colored people accused of crime is without the excuse, which has sometimes been urged by mobs, for a failure to pursue the appointed methods for the punishment of crime, that the accused have an undue influence over courts and juries. Such acts are a reproach to the community where they occur, and so far as they can be made the subject of federal jurisdiction, the strongest repressive legislation is demanded. A public sentiment that will sustain the officers of the law in resisting mobs and in protecting accused persons in their custody should be promoted by every possible means. The officer who gives his life in the brave discharge of his duty is worthy of special honor. No lesson needs to be so urgently impressed upon our people as this, that no worthy end or cause can be promoted by lawlessness. This exhibit of the work of the executive departments is submitted to Congress and to the public in the hope that there will be found in it a due sense of responsibility and an earnest purpose to maintain the national honor and to promote the happiness and prosperity of all our people, and this brief exhibit of the growth and prosperity of the country will give us a level from which to note the increase or decadence that new legislative policies may bring to us. There is no reason why the national influence, power, and prosperity should not observe the same rates of increase that have characterized the past 30 years. We carry the great impulse and increase of these years into the future. There is no reason why in many lines of production we should not surpass all other nations, as we have already done in some. There are no near frontiers to our possible development. Retrogression would be a crime. Benjamin J. Harrison. End of Benjamin Harrison's State of the Union Address to Congress, December 6, 1892. Read by John Greenman.